Hi, it's Jeff Roberts. I have a question for Anthony. Do you want me to display our presentation, and can you allow the screen sharing?
Councilor Sabrina Wheeler, the time of the meeting has arrived and you have a quorum.
Mr. Clerk, should we go ahead and get started?
Yes, the time of the meeting has arrived and you have a quorum.
Great, thank you. With that, I call this meeting of the Transportation and Public Utilities Committee to order. The call of the meeting is to discuss car storage policies in Cambridge. Pursuant to Chapter 20 of the Acts of 2021, adopted by the Massachusetts General Assembly and approved by the Governor, the city is authorized to use remote participation at meetings of the Cambridge City Council and its committees. In addition to having members of the council participate remotely, we have also set up Zoom teleconference for public comment. Please be aware that Zoom is primarily being used for public comment. In order to watch the meeting, please tune into channel 22 or visit the open meeting portal on the city's website. If you would like to provide public comment, please visit the City Council section of the city's webpage. Instructions for how to speak or sign up to speak are posted there. Once you have completed the sign up procedure, you will receive a link to the Zoom meeting. We will not allow any additional public comment sign up after 10:30 a.m. Mr. Clerk, could you take roll call of the members present?
Vice Mayor Mallon.
Present and audible.
Present. Councilor Nolan. Councilor Nolan. Absent. Councilor Toomey. Absent. Councilor Zondervan.
Present and audible.
Present. Councilor Sabrina Wheeler.
Present and audible.
There are 3 members present.
With that, all of today's votes will be by roll call. I also want to acknowledge we have Councilor Carolyn here with us, and Mayor Siddiqui let me know she wouldn't be able to attend, but members of her staff are watching the meeting.
Chair,
Yes, Councilor Vice Mayor Mallon?
may I raise a point of order?
Of course.
The live link for this meeting is not up yet on the city's webpage. I just wanted to alert.
Audible.
Present. Councilor Sabrina Wheeler.
Present and audible.
There are 3 members present.
With that, all of today's votes will be by roll.
Sure, parking that we could. So it's a little odd, but that's why that's being shown there. Since we received the policy order back about a month ago, we've been working, the group that Iram mentioned has been working collaboratively to pull together some information that we thought would help contribute to the council's discussion on this topic. And that includes a little bit of data that we had on hand, as well as some information about the various rules and regulations that are currently in place, and they get a little bit complicated, but we'll walk through that. We also have a little bit of insight on what's happening more broadly in planning around parking and automobile related policies these days, and some discussion about what we plan to do next. So I'm going to start by passing it over to Stephanie to talk a little bit about some of the information about parking in Cambridge.
Good morning. Let's start with the next slide, please. Great. So I just want to start with a few quick data points to set the stage for our policy conversations, starting with residential parking permits. So this slide shows while the total number of households in Cambridge has increased in recent years, that's the yellow line, the number of resident permits has declined a little. That's the blue line. So that means that the number of parking permits per household has been falling. That's the red diamond, which is good because we are one of the few municipalities that set an explicit goal to reduce resident car ownership as part of our transportation and climate goals. Next slide. We also have goals for how people get around. So the city's Moving Forward 2020 report has some great information to get a sense of travel trends. Next slide. So this graph comes from that report. It shows commute modes for 3 groups of people: workers, residents, and residents who work in Cambridge. Less than half of workers drive alone to jobs in Cambridge. So that's the 43% on the far left, regardless of where they live. So those are workers coming into Cambridge. Less than a third of Cambridge residents drive alone to work, regardless of where they work. And that 14% on the blue bar shows that only 14% of people who live and work in Cambridge drive alone. Next slide. So looking at just the commuting patterns of Cambridge workers since 2000, the trend generally shows the drive alone rate going down, which is not the national trend, where single occupancy vehicle rate is staying steady. Next. So next, please. Next, now we'll describe the current regulations that relate to parking, starting with the Parking and Transportation Demand Management Ordinance, which is called PTDM. Next slide. So PTDM is part of a long-term strategy to give people choices for getting around. It prioritizes sustainable modes like walking, biking, transit, and carpooling. And in addition to reducing traffic and greenhouse gas emissions, getting people into these modes also reduces air and noise pollution. Next slide. So this is how the ordinance works. We know how many parking spaces are on each non-residential parcel in the city. And when a property owner increases parking on their parcel, they trigger PTDM because we know that adding parking will generate drive-alone trips. The ordinance has an enforcement provision that's essential in making sure that people comply. So if a property is out of compliance in some way, the city can fine it $10 per space per day and shut down the parking facility until it comes back into compliance. But we've never had to enforce on a property because just the threat of enforcement has brought movement on their part. Next slide. So through PTDM and special permits, we can influence the travel choices of a huge portion of people who work in Cambridge. In 2019, which is the last year that we received a monitoring report due to the COVID pandemic, the city received reports for 52 projects, and that represented 26,000 parking spaces. These projects include 33 million square feet of development, and they cover the commuting activities of about 48,000 employees, which is a third of Cambridge employees. Next. And you can see from this graph monitoring data. So over the past 18 years, the average SOV rate dropped from 49% to 49 to 35%. And I just want to mention there's so much behind these numbers because it's not just due to the PTDM ordinance. The city also added a lot of sustainable mobility infrastructure during that time. And we've reduced parking rates and we've run a lot of encouragement campaigns. And also these 2019 numbers contain results for many more projects than in the early years. But this is going to just show you the general trend of where we're going. And I'll hand it over to Jeff now.
Thanks, Stephanie. So now back to everyone's favorite topic of zoning. And I tend to start just by giving a reminder that zoning is about regulating land use, and that, despite the 500 pages or so of text in our zoning ordinance, it really breaks down into 2 questions. What's allowed where within the city, and then for a given type of land use that's allowed, what are the development standards that need to be followed? So the zoning map is the key piece that I think a lot of people are familiar with. That's what tells us what's allowed where. And in Article 6 of the zoning ordinance is where we regulate 3 specific things. Parking, which is for automobiles, which is where you might be sort of warehousing cars for other reasons that aren't necessarily going anywhere. So parking can be used in a limited capacity for other kinds of things like car sharing programs. We, in our retail zoning recently adopted, we talk about sort of other temporary uses. But one of the issues there is that if the parking is required, that could be an issue that prevents some of the flexibility in use that might otherwise be available. One of the more complicated concepts that I've found to explain with parking as a land use is that it can be either accessory parking, meaning that it's part of another use like a residential building or a commercial building, or it can be a principal use, meaning that it's just a separate land use unto itself, not attached to anything else. If parking is accessory, then it's allowed wherever the principal use is allowed, but it has to be located within a certain distance of that principal use, and it can only be used by users of that principal use. On the other hand, if parking is principal use parking, then there are no real limitations on who can park there because it's parking on its own. And sometimes the metaphor I like to use is that accessory parking is kind of like the side of fries that you get with a meal. Principal use parking is like fries that you get for the table. So here's where we get into the requirements in zoning. So accessory parking is in many cases required to be included along with a principal use, while principal use parking isn't necessarily required, but it's an allowed use in certain districts within the city, and it might be subject to other requirements, which we're going to talk about a little bit later, which go outside of the zoning ordinance. So this is just an overview because we were asked to provide a little information about minimum and maximum accessory parking requirements as they currently exist. And this is what exists in base zoning. There are some changes where you get into sort of overlay zoning, which I'll talk about. The minimum requirement is fairly simple. For residential uses, it's 1 space per unit. That is relatively low compared to a lot of other communities, and it's a uniform throughout the city. Non-residential uses, the requirements are a little bit sort of all over the map, both figuratively and literally, because it varies by district. So in more dense zoning districts with that are closer to transit, the minimum requirements tend to be lower for those non-residential uses, and they tend to be a little bit higher as you get into less dense zoning districts that are further away from transit. Most non-residential uses also have maximum parking ratios in zoning. They tend to be somewhat high, and if you look at our zoning requirements compared to or parking requirements in some other communities, in a lot of cases our maximum is more comparable to what other communities might have as their minimum or their kind of standard parking ratios. I'd point out one thing, which is that as a result of the recent zoning changes that the City Council adopted for small businesses, existing buildings are no longer required to add parking spaces if a new use goes into that building. So that's a pretty significant change, particularly as it affects the kinds of small businesses that might be leasing space in existing building stock. In recent years, the city's done a number of area studies that have led to reduced maximum parking ratios, and those have been implemented in some key areas, including Kendall Square and Central Square. And there are recommended maximum parking ratios that are in the Alewife District Plan for that part of the city. So these maximum ratios were developed to align with particular drive-alone mode split goals. So those were developed with a lot of help from Stephanie and using the data that is available from our PTDM process. There are a lot of other standards in Article 6 of the zoning that relate to parking, and I won't go through all of it, but the one interesting thing to note is that most of our zoning requirements, including the quantity of parking, the amount that you're required to have, can be modified by special permit, and that provides a lot of flexibility within Cambridge, and it's been fairly common and typical for different types of proposals, from large proposals to small proposals, to seek that flexibility in permitting. And just for a quick historical background, since we were asked about that, zoning has only been requiring parking for about the past 60 years. That's when minimum zoning requirements for parking were first introduced. About 40 years ago, those requirements were amended by splitting apart those minimum and maximum ratios by zoning district. And then about 20 years after that, as part of the rezoning in 2001, the minimum and maximum ratios were reduced for office and lab uses. And the story since then, really over the past 20 years, has been, in terms of changes that have been implemented by the city council, has been to lower parking ratios in specific areas, provide additional relief, as well as increasing the requirements for bicycle parking and allowing for car sharing and other kinds of flexibility. So I'll turn away from zoning now and turn it over to Joe Barr to talk a little bit more about other regulations.
Thanks, Jeff, and thanks, Councilor Sedoon and members of the committee for having us here today. So one thing I wanted to sort of just quickly go over was commercial parking as it relates to the commercial parking freeze. So this is different from commercial parking in terms of parking for commercial uses, like Jeff was talking about, office or lab or retail, but the official quote unquote commercial parking, which is regulated as part of the, or was implemented, sorry, as part of the state implementation plan for the Clean Air Act back really in the 1970s is when it started. And the parking freeze exists in both our local ordinances and regulations, but also at the state and federal level in the regulations relating to the Clean Air Act implementation. Chapter 10.16 is where it exists in our ordinances, just as background. And the definition in there means a parking space available for use by the general public at any time for a fee. So it's what you would have typically might have called ticket spitter type parking in the past, where anyone can drive up and park there and pay a fee. So if it's accessory parking for residential or non-residential uses of the type that Jeff was talking about with the parking minimums and maximums, it's not commercial parking, although commercial parking can serve that purpose, but it's not de facto commercial parking. Parking on public streets is not commercial parking, so our metered parking spaces on streets are not commercial parking, although our off-street metered parking lots are commercial parking. And park and ride facilities operated by the T are also not part of commercial parking. I think the other important thing to say is if a group like one real estate developer leases parking spaces from another real estate developer in a block of 100 spaces or something like that, that is also not commercial parking on its face, because it's not available to the general public for a fee. It's being leased directly by one entity to another entity. So those types of arrangements also do not qualify as commercial parking. So next slide. So some policy things to think about with commercial parking. Since the late 90s, actually, and Suzanne and others, including myself, have been involved in this on and off through that period of time. We've been in a process actually with the state and federal governments to modify. Some people call it replacing the parking freeze. I really more think of it as modifying and providing greater flexibility with the parking freeze. That process has not yet been completed, even though it's been ongoing for 20 years for various reasons, having to do with the difficulty of making changes to state and federal regulations, as well as other priorities coming up for all of the levels of government involved. But in the meantime, the context, or in the meantime, since the parking freeze was originally created, the context has really changed. And I think one thing from a policy perspective that we're starting to have realized and started to think about how we would act on is that accessory parking, in some ways, as I think part of the sort of impetus for this conversation, is really the problem. And perhaps more flexibility with commercial parking may actually be what we're looking for, because then you're really using a market incentive of pricing to discourage it from being overused, like many transportation resources that aren't priced in a rational way. It creates more flexibility because commercial parking is kind of the most flexible possible parking you can have. It's, you can market it to the public, you can use it as accessory parking if you want to, you can charge for it, you can not charge for it. And one of the original reasons for the parking freeze was that there was a significant concern that, Kendall Square in particular, after it had been cleared and not then, developed, could become a parking lot for downtown Boston, given the good transit access from Kendall Square to downtown Boston. I think subsequent action since then have shown that that's an unlikely outcome for Kendall Square, since it's some of the most valuable real estate in the region, if not in the entire country. And so that kind of original reason for having a parking freeze seems to have kind of come and gone. And so we really need to think about what the right parking policies are. And under any future changes, that there would still be a process for granting commercial parking permits. So the city would still retain that authority. And we could use that as a policy lever to, address issues around where is commercial parking located, how much commercial parking is created, are there equity issues, are there other issues we need to deal with? But we're not just proposing to create a free-for-all. If we relax the parking freeze, we're just more saying, there would be more flexibility and potentially would allow us to address certain parking issues that we're not able to address right now. Next slide. So then turning to the resident permit parking program, probably most of you know this because you're all Cambridge residents, but basically our resident permits are for passenger vehicles and motorcycles and allow you to park in areas that say parking by permit only. And the program is defined and created both in our ordinances, chapter 10.12 mostly, but also in the enabling state legislation that created the traffic and parking department. So some of the elements of how that program operates are required under state law, not just under city ordinance or our regulations. Next slide. So you have to show proof of residency and within the last 30 days and provide 2 proofs of your residency in Cambridge. 1 utility bill is typical, along with another or along with 1 or 2 pieces of mail to provide that verification. Vehicle must be registered in Massachusetts. It must be registered at your residential address in Cambridge. And importantly, the garage code must be in Cambridge, which is an issue really around insurance fraud. But it's something we have to check for in the registry and make sure that it is in fact garaged in Cambridge. So next slide. So the fees, as I think everyone knows, are set by the City Council and actually in the Vehicle Trip Reduction Ordinance, chapter 10.17 of the ordinances. $25 per permit, which also includes 1 visitor parking permit, and the fees are waived for folks who are over 65 or have a disability plate or placard. One of the things we've heard very loud and clear from the council recently is that there's a strong desire to look at sort of means testing of some sort, and we've thought about how that could work. The Blue Bikes program for low-income residents is a good example of sort of basing it on other means tested and means qualified programs, such as SNAP or fuel assistance or other things. And we definitely recognize that if at any time we're going to be suggesting a fee increase, that needs to be paired with a program for low income or residents or for means testing for folks. So that's definitely something that's on our radar screen. We don't have a formal plan for that, but it's definitely something we're thinking about and investigating, both on the policy side, but also on the kind of operational technology side, how that would actually be implemented in practice. Next slide. So some policy considerations for resident permit parking. I think we all agree, at least on the staff side, that it's really hard to talk about changing parking requirements for residential land uses and zoning without also talking about the resident permit program, because there's a strong interaction between them. If private developments are providing less parking, then that potentially, I won't say it absolutely will, but that potentially or certainly has the risk and the sort of public perception that it will increase pressure on on-street parking. And since most of our parking in this, most of our curb frontage in the city is reserved for residential parking, we're sort of, if you crank down, quote unquote, one, it may have impacts on the other. And so I think we really need to be thinking about the policies and the pricing of residential parking at the same time that we're talking about anything that has to do with changing zoning requirements, at least on a significant basis. Obviously, the affordable housing overlay did that, and I think that's something we can manage as a potentially more limited impact. But if that's expanded, I think we need to think seriously about what that means, because other things are happening, right? We're repurposing street space for a lot of other uses. And so the supply of on-street parking is going down in general. And so that is tightening up regardless of what we do with resident parking or with zoning. And so all these things are sort of coming together roughly at the same time. And obviously we all hope for lower car ownership and less use of on-street parking. But I think that's something that, not everyone is fully there in terms of either, accepting that is something that's going to happen or being comfortable with that happening. And so I think we need to manage that. And, Stephanie and others will talk a little bit about, next steps and community input on that. The other thing just to think about is that currently, the rough cost according to AAA of vehicle ownership is about $10,000 a year. So our current permit fee is, 0.25% of that. So if we're really talking about changing resident permit pricing to, change people's behavior in terms of car ownership, I think, it would be a pretty substantial increase, because even if that became $100, that's still only 1%. $1,000 is 10%, and that seems like something that would potentially, change people's perception of it. But, $1,000 for resident permit is a pretty significant change from today, even if we do add a means tested program. So I think we just really need to think about kind of what level of pricing is going to impact people's behavior versus, what might be, realistic for people to think about in the current situation. So next slide. Real briefly on curb cuts, which I know is sort of a side topic. Zoning defined standards for curb cuts, width, location, and other elements. Multiple departments, including traffic and parking, DPW, historical and inspectional services review applications, which then go to the city council for approval, since it's a sort of grant of access on the public way. I think one thing that's, and that's a process that's existed for a long time, and it's sort of worked or not worked depending on your perspective, but that's the way the process works. One thing that's very unclear that we've talked about internally a decent amount is there's not really any process for removing or retiring a curb cut, either because we have some safety issue with it and we need to say to someone, what, this curb cut's really not working and we need to come up with some other solution, or it's clear there's no driveway there anymore and we want to get rid of that curb cut for various reasons. And that process it's very unclear. And once that authority to travel across the public way has been granted, is there any way to actually, remove that? So I don't know the answer to that question. That's a legal question, but it certainly operationally creates some challenges for us and also for DPW as they reconstruct streets. So with that, I will turn it back to Jeff.
Thanks. And I'm just going to take the next couple minutes just to talk quickly about some of the conversation that's occurred around parking regulations, both within Cambridge and just in the planning world in general, touching on many of the things that Joe just mentioned. So one of the concepts is, limiting the parking supply, which is something that Cambridge has already been doing through some of the maximum parking ratios and other things that we've just talked about. It's been noted that limiting parking supply is a tool that we have to help reduce traffic and benefit neighborhoods and serve the city's other environmental goals, particularly in the case of non-residential uses. This is something that we've found to be particularly important. The issue with this approach is that, Cambridge doesn't necessarily exist on an island. We're affected by regional development patterns. And so even if the parking supply is limited, there could and will continue to be some demand for parking that needs to be met. So that's something that needs to be balanced. Another concept which we have talked about and has been implemented in those areas that I mentioned before, Kendall and Central Square, is removing the minimum parking requirements. We've done this. Other communities have been looking at this more recently. The motivation behind this concept is that property owners and the market in general can regulate how much or how little parking is needed for a land use, rather than the city needing to regulate that. However, in a place like Cambridge, where there is public parking available, as Joe mentioned, the burden to meet parking demand could shift more to public facilities like on-street parking, if the private market isn't providing the parking that is demanded. There are other communities that have been looking at this, and in recent years, many communities have been looking at this for different kinds of uses, not necessarily. I think in one case, San Francisco has eliminated the minimum parking requirements citywide, but in other cases, it's been a little bit more targeted. A lot of it towards residential uses, which again is a little different than the approach that's been taken in Cambridge in certain cases where it's been for non-residential uses that it's been that change has been made. But in some cases, it focuses just on particular areas of the city and or particular kinds of uses. Another concept that has been gaining some traction in the planning world is the idea of making the use of parking more flexible, relying less on accessory parking and relying on more of that a la carte kind of parking, such as the commercial parking that Joe described. The idea here is that parking can be allocated and priced in a way that meets demand more efficiently. The benefit is that more needs can be accommodated with less parking. But without some controls, one of the possible concerns is that if parking is being used more efficiently, it might not really have the same impacts in terms of reducing traffic. Some communities, including Cambridge, have implemented approaches in this vein, such as shared parking, unbundling parking from rents in multifamily residential buildings, and even pricing public parking to be more responsive to demand. I didn't put it on the list, I forgot to, but I know that our neighbors to the north in Somerville have been implementing policies of relying mainly on principal use parking in some of the redevelopment areas like Assembly Square and Union Square, as opposed to accessory parking. Another thing we've been thinking about in Cambridge and others have as well is the impact of technologies and economic trends that have had an impact on parking, lots of which people are familiar with. There are lots that are still evolving as we speak. And that's really one of the issues is that, these shifts all come with benefits and drawbacks. And as they're evolving so quickly, it's impossible to know what the total overall effects are going to be at this point. So for example, we see that the growth in ride hailing and delivery service has reduced some of the demand for parking, but that doesn't necessarily reduce traffic because there's still vehicles on the street. At some point, they all need to park somewhere. And it also creates other needs in terms of space for pickup and drop off activities. And a final thing to note on that is that for these supply side strategies to really work, it also requires the demand side approaches. And Stephanie is the expert on that. But from my perspective, this is really one of the secret weapons in our transportation planning arsenal. It's much more complex and nuanced than something like zoning changes, but it's been one of the more effective tools that we have and it really is something that pairs very effectively with other supply-based strategies. I think other communities are really starting to catch on to the importance of TDM, but Cambridge has really been the leader in this and has a long track record of success. So as we look at these issues as planners, we look at them at a high level, but we also can't ignore the fact that parking is a very personal issue. Different people's experience with parking is different. We know that not everyone in the community owns cars or uses parking, but it does have economic and environmental costs that are borne by the entire community. On the other hand, we acknowledge that our regional transportation patterns still rely to a great extent on auto use. For many people, having a car and being able to park it can provide opportunities that people might not have otherwise. So we think this high-level view of parking also needs to involve sensitivity to the real experience of community members. And Stephanie, in a bit, will talk a little bit about some of the thinking we're doing on that. And we can't ignore that parking can be an emotional issue. So this is kind of a quote that I noted from one of the more sort of prominent voices in the academic planning world around parking. It's not really meant as a joke here. I think we all know that if you rely on a car and you don't have easy access to a place to park that car, it can be a major source of stress. And I think we see that play out when we engage with people on some of these questions around parking. So in summary, a number of things we can change in zoning having to do with maximum or minimum parking ratios, as well as some of these broader land use considerations about principal use versus accessory parking. Some of these might reinforce each other. Each of them have their own kind of balance of policy pros and cons that we've talked about. And the zoning approaches could be complemented by other non-zoning tools around PTDM, different ways of managing commercial parking or on-street parking, as Joe described. And to end, Stephanie will talk a little bit about where we're thinking this might go from here.
So as you've seen in these last few slides, there are many ideas out there about what kind of changes could be made to parking policy. But consideration of any parking regulation changes should be done in partnership with the community as part of a discussion about mobility needs and policy trade-offs and scenario preferences. Next slide. So knowing that, we've designed a project whose purpose is to evaluate how the city regulates parking from the perspective of how well they fulfill the city's planning policies related to traffic congestion, greenhouse gas emissions, climate resilience, housing, economic development, and social equity. Next. So we expect this work would start in the fall of 2021 and continue into 2022. The goals of community engagement are to learn about people's mobility needs and to hear a wide range of perspectives and build an understanding of how parking works in the city, as well as discussing policy alternatives with people. So that would put us on track to bring recommendations as a result of this community engagement process to the council later next year. Thank you.
Great. If that's it for presentations from staff, and thank you for those really helpful presentations, we'll go to public comment. Mr. Clerk and Stefan. Oh, great. Looks like it's been queued up.
The first speaker for public comment is Jean Oster. Jean Oster.
I just wanted to comment that on the recent studies about parking. Are you able to hear me? The recent studies about parking do not take into the economic impact on the small businesses from Arlington to Harvard Square. Removing public parking meters would put a lot of our businesses out of business. We do have local customers, but our local customers come from anywhere from a 30-minute drive. So I really wish that they would consider keeping our local businesses in business. Thank you.
The next speaker is Bill McAvini.
Hi, I'm Bill McAvini from 12 Douglas Street. I'll acknowledge that I'm a member of the Transit Advisory Committee in Cambridge and also a leader in A Better Cambridge, but I'm only speaking today from my own point of view. First thing I'd like to talk about is a philosophical point. Do we as a city consider housing to be a human right? Do we provide it for the vast majority of people in as a subsidized product? No. But certainly from my point of view, it seems like the city and generally accepts that providing a heavily subsidized parking space for a car is a human right. It's provided to the vast majority of people who own cars, and those of us like myself who do not own a car are required to pay for that, for the city providing parking spaces. The second thing I wanted to talk about was just sort of what the experience of being someone who does not own a car is. Carolyn, my wife, and I got rid of our car in 2006. At that point in time, it was only 10% more expensive to go without a car than it was to own a car. Since that time, very little has changed in terms of the governmental fees that have been added to driving. The gas tax has not changed. The Cost of transit has gone up significantly. For those of us without cars, it's a mix. We sometimes have to use cars. So we do occasionally rent vehicles, particularly for when we go away for a weekend or even when we go away for a week or more. And those fees have also gone up. The charges, they're not quote taxes, but they're quote fees that have been added to that. Recently, there was a proposal to add a tax to ride-hailing services like Uber and Lyft, and that would have changed my behavior. That really would have made me reconsider whether I could afford to live without buying a car. So that's it. Thank you.
The next speaker is Annette Osgood.
Annette Osgood, please unmute yourself. You do have the floor. Mr. Clerk, Annette seems to be having trouble unmuting herself.
We will go to Carolyn Fuller.
Hi. Hello, my name is Carolyn Fuller. I am a resident of Central Square, Cambridge. I'm actually Bill McAvinney's wife, and I'm talking in support of removing the parking minimums from our zoning laws. I have lived here for over 40 years. For 25 of those years, I owned a car. And yeah, I did experience that fight or flight mentality when I would search for a parking place for 45 minutes. It was miserable. But then one day I decided, I could get rid of this car and I would no longer have to spend 45 minutes looking for a parking spot. And, we got rid of it in 2006. And one of the things that you don't point out about not owning a car is what it does to a person's mental and physical health. We walk 5 miles a day, and it's it's wonderful. The biggest impact it has had for me personally has been on my mental and physical health. And I just, when parking is painful, it does encourage you to think about getting rid of your car, which is incredibly healthy for our environment as well as our personal lives. So that's it. Thank you so much.
The next speaker is Suzanne Gliet.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for this great meeting. And it coincides with a group that I've been working with on a weekly basis over the summer that's addressing housing issues. And it's across political groups across the city with specialists and residents. And we're working with Patrick Barrett. And we've had parking on our agenda the last couple of weeks. And I think where we will come to on this, and we will provide a report, is a broader consensus around for residential 0.5 minimum if you're living within 0.5 miles. But in one case, somebody asked whether somebody like Joe Barr could be asked on a one-by-one basis, what is available parking, and provide a kind of formula. We think it's important to keep permeable spaces, particularly green spaces, in this. We want or would be asking for employers' parking to be made available to everyone. So it's not just those employees. And hopefully there could be some cost reduction provided by the city for those who would be means tested for this. That would make more available parking. Also make known and supported low-income parking permits for healthcare workers and others who are here to work with seniors. We're concerned about the impact of things like the MMH and for market rate luxury housing, where you can get an increase of about $100,000 value for each new resident if you have parking. So we worry about the equity issue here. And of course, Uber and Lyft fees are way up. We need an area plan so that Facebook, that's just coming in, universities and Google require some kind of parking engagement in the area So it's not just on the shoulders of those of us who are residents here. I love a disincentive for commercial parking. Thank you for that. With COVID, we're going to get about a 20% drop in offices, and more people are going to be working from home wherever. So that's going to impact parking. Why are lab numbers so high? I'm just asking this now, 80.80. Can't that, and the fact that it can be modified with special permits, a problem? Can we charge more for SUVs? Can we encourage and actually allow bicycle-drawn taxis? Rickshaws would be amazing. I could imagine them on everything from Memorial Drive to moving through Harvard Square. And the city really needs to make known the maximum residential and commercial size, because that's what's impacting us. Yes to community engagement. We need the neighborhood groups heavily involved with this, and we need to add snow removal, because as we're walking, the city needs to clear the streets because it is dangerous. And finally, I have a parking space. I don't drive. I walk everywhere, and I support us working on this. I think it's very important. Thank you.
The next speaker is Gary Mello.
Thank you, Mr. Clerk. My name is Gary Mello. I live on Franklin Street. No fee or increase in fees for residential stickers is going to reduce the number of cars in Cambridge. The annual renewal program for residential stickers is a completely unnecessary, purposeless waste of time and money for both the city and residents. It's a make-work program yielding no benefit, which fails any clean sheet analysis. Secondly, I'd like to talk about, I want to issue a challenge to this committee. I want you to consider for the first time the number of Cambridge City employees who commute to work in Cambridge by car. Let's take a look at 243 Broadway. Let's take a look behind City Hall. These are areas you can address that you can, in fact, reduce the number of people, the number of cars that are coming into our city every day. Seems to me that you've skirted this issue year after year. It's a sacred cow thing that you don't want to touch. But you know, telling residents that that they're spending too much of their time and money on cars while failing to address that group of employees, you can in fact restrict from coming into the city by car. That's a failure I really wish you'd look at for the first time. Thank you, Mr. Clerk.
The next speaker is Jonathan Behrens.
Hi, Jonathan Behrens, 115 Hampshire Street. Thanks to the presenters for a comprehensive overview of what's going on with parking in the city. I support ending parking minimums, imposing parking maximums where applicable, and also increasing the permit costs for vehicle owners. As someone without a car, I want to echo some of the prior commenters in saying that our city's treatment of people without cars is highly inequitable. A parking permit costs just over $2 a month, which is about 1/50th of what they're actually worth. If you had to buy private parking somewhere, it would cost you about 50 times more. At the same time, a visitor parking permit, which is what you need to get as a resident if you don't have a car and you want to ever rent vehicles or have friends visit from out of town or whatever, you need a visitor parking permit. This costs the same amount as a resident parking permit. So just being a non-car owner who wants to occasionally use vehicles, I have to pay just as much as someone who pollutes the environment every single day driving their car and parking it in the city. Now, to add insult to injury, this resident parking permit comes with a free visitor permit too. So that's just almost a slap in the face that I'm paying the same amount for something that these car owners are getting for free. On the second point, parking minimums are unnecessary at this point in time. Plenty of people walk to work, bike to work, take public transit. We saw of people who live and work in Cambridge, only 16% of them take a vehicle to work. So there's tons of potential to live without a car. But in new construction, we're requiring people to buy parking spaces that they don't want or need. So I encourage you to end parking minimums, to take actions to increase the parking permit cost to make them be equitable to what they're worth to residents and the cost to the city. Thank you.
The next speaker is Heather Hoffman.
Hello, Heather Hoffman, 213 Hurley Street. I don't have a ton to say about parking except that my observation over the years that I have lived here is that we exist mostly on magical thinking. People looking out their windows, walking around, can see conditions that more often than not bear absolutely no relation to what we're being told by the people who claim that they have all the real numbers. My prime exhibit for this is the abomination that was called a parking study on the First Street garage, which said, among other things, that, yeah, if you do this, people who currently have permits will drive up and be told there's nowhere for them to park. And the conclusion was, that's okay, they'll figure something out, because it's more important for us to sell this parking to a developer who doesn't want to deal with this on its own. So I come at this with so much skepticism and so much belief that the city just believes that cars don't do what cars do. I do not drive a whole lot. I have a car. I have a driveway that came with my house when I bought it. I didn't have a car for years and years. But there are things that I do that need one. And I know that a lot of the people I share this city with are in much the same position. So I hope that the decisions that we make are based on real facts and not on the wishes and dreams of how we want people to act instead of how they actually act. Thanks.
The next speaker is Alan Sedoon.
There we go.
Alan, please go ahead.
Sorry about that. Can you hear me?
We can hear you. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Hi, my name is Alan Sedoon. I live at 24 Union Street. We have no parking spaces and no cars. It's great. Really appreciated the city staff presentation. I wanted to point out one discrepancy in the strategy section. When Mr. Roberts was talking about reducing parking supply, he said an issue with that is that there will still be demand that needs to be satisfied that we can't affect. But then a few slides later, he talked about using flexible parking to accommodate demand. And he said an issue with that is that if you can accommodate the demand, then it won't decrease traffic. To me, these two concerns seem to contradict each other a little bit. If flexible parking spaces can reduce the number of parking spaces and allocate that space to housing or open space without any decrease in traffic, without any decrease in parking accommodation, that's great. And if they do cause a decrease in traffic, that's also great. These strategies are great no matter what. And I particularly think we need to be expanding metering to parking spaces all over the city because metered parking is much more frequently available than unmetered parking. And metered parking spaces are much better at being flexible. But to put this in perspective, I do want to point out what I thought was the biggest take-home number from the presentation. 43% of people who work in Cambridge drive alone to work, but only 16% of people who live in and work in Cambridge drive alone to work. That's a huge difference. All of the little behavioral nudges that we're talking about are really important. But if we really, really want to make a change in people's driving behavior, the biggest thing we can do is to make it so that the people who are working in Cambridge can live and work in Cambridge. So, everything comes back to our massive housing shortage and our need to build more housing. Thank you very much.
That is it for the individuals who signed up for public comment. Ms. Stefan, I would like to try to go back to Annette Osgood if she has fixed her issue.
Annette Osgood, if you can unmute yourself, you have the floor. Annette does not.
Hi, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
We can hear you. Please go ahead.
Hi, I was just wanting to say that I agree with the person that said it's really unrealistic to think, well, if you don't have parking spaces, you're not going to have cars. Even people that don't have their own car still will take the Ubers, they'll take the, they need to be, the lack of parking I just think is really detrimental to businesses. And if you look at Harvard Square and Central Square and what happened when they removed the parking spaces is all the little independent stores left. All you have left are you have the banks and the nationwide chains. People do need to drive, they do need to park, otherwise you're just not going to have a small business. And I'm sorry that was a little bit rambly, but I am at work and I have like the phone ringing off the hook. But thanks for getting back to me and letting me have my say. Okay.
That's it for the individuals in public comment.
All right, thank you, Mr. Clerk. Thanks to everyone who signed up for public comment. I don't believe we need to close public comment, so we can go now to questions from members of the committee and members of the council. More broadly, if you'd like to raise your hand, I can recognize you. I see Councilor Zondervan first.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks for organizing this meeting, and especially thanks for using the term car storage in the call to the meeting. I think it's really important to reclaim that word. I don't know if everybody knows the origin of the word, of the verb to park, but it was originally meant to plant trees alongside the roadway. And people started tying their horses to the trees. And then when cars were invented, parking their cars under the trees. And the term transferred to the act of placing your car under the tree. But we shouldn't use that word because it makes no sense to call storing your car parking. And it really points to the crux of the problem, which is that car storage is one of the worst land uses that we could employ in our city. So I really appreciate the presentations as well. I thought they were very informative and helpful. And I hope that we can get to a policy regime that really drives our car storage and car usage to zero. And I do want to acknowledge all the comments in public comment because I drive a car and it is really difficult to get around without one, particularly in my case because I'm having mobility challenges at the moment. So I think we need to have this conversation more broadly and not just talk about how do we reduce car storage and car usage, but also how do we make the alternatives much more accessible and convenient and affordable. And, for example, can we have free shuttles that drive people around the city? These days they can be electric and we can cut down on pollution significantly. And if people no longer need a car to do what they need to do, then naturally fewer and fewer people will own cars. And we're already seeing that across the state. And we see some of that in our residential parking permit data as well, that people already are owning fewer cars. So imagine what could happen if we made it even more convenient not to have to own a car. I did want to challenge the number of $10,000 a year, I realize it comes from AAA, not from our traffic department itself, but I certainly pay a lot less than that to own a car, about half of that for leasing a brand new electric vehicle. So I think, car ownership is still, for many people, a more convenient and affordable way to get around. And we really have to counteract that if we are going to reduce our car ownership and car storage in Cambridge. So I guess my question I guess primarily for Mr. Roberts would be what it would take for us to get to a minimum requirement of 0 and a maximum requirement of 0, particularly for residential parking in new construction. Is that a feasible goal, and how can we get there?
Mr. Roberts?
Thank you to the chair, through the chair. So I'm just trying to get my head around the question. So I think as we presented in our presentation, the parking requirements are in the zoning ordinance, and they can be amended. So, and it has been the case both in Cambridge and other places that the minimum parking requirements could be reduced, maximum parking requirements could be reduced. I think one of the issues in going, just the last part of that comment, and going to say that the maximum requirements would be 0 would essentially mean that any site with accessory parking would then become non-conforming to zoning. And that might raise a lot of issues that we haven't really fully investigated yet. For the most part, what the city's strategy has been in terms of setting minimum and maximum parking ratios, particularly in terms of redevelopment areas, has been trying to, bring the minimum parking ratios down in some cases for non-residential uses all the way to 0, and then to have maximum parking ratios that limit the total amount of parking that can be created from new development. And that's something that can continue to be, and we'll continue to look at to see, and use the information that we've been able to get through our PTDM program to figure out what are the appropriate ways to set that ratio and then lower it as needs be in order to meet the city's goals. So I think that you could, the simple answer is you can change the minimum parking requirements, you can change the maximum parking requirements, but changing the maximum parking requirements has a different kind of impact. Maybe I'll try to put it a different way. The minimum parking requirements tell you what you have to provide, and then the maximum parking requirements tell you what you can't provide. And so the impact that has across the city, if you're looking at it from a base zoning point of view, is very different. It would be very different to say all this parking that exists is not required, and therefore you have more flexibility to turn it into something else, versus saying this parking is not allowed. And then that creates a different set of issues.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Chair, is it not possible to craft the zoning language so that for example, a parking maximum of 0 would explicitly apply only for new construction, and also, of course, there would still be a possibility of allowing it by special permit or through a zoning variance.
So through the chair, you can sometimes do things that will. So in general, zoning only affects new uses or changes to uses of land. So the kind of foundational idea with zoning is that everything that was legally established at the time it was established can continue to be maintained. It's just when a change is proposed that it that it has to be brought into conformance or has to seek some kind of relief, going to the BZA in order to authorize that change if it's not in conformance with the current zoning. The zoning has to be again, it also depends whether we're talking about base zoning, the underlying zoning for everything, which has to be uniform across a district. So you can't say the rules for this site and then this site next door to it and this other site next door to that are all different. It has to be the same rules applied broadly throughout the district. But you could, as we've done with areas like our redevelopment areas where we have overlay zoning and other zoning tools that we use, we are able to craft it a bit more to apply just to new development or just to specific kinds of new development.
Great, thank you so much.
Ms. Farouk, did you want to respond there as well?
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I just wanted to add one thing, in philosophically in terms of eliminating or taking parking minimums down to zero for non-residential development. I think that's a philosophical idea that we can all get behind. I would say that the reducing parking maximum allowances, like what anybody can do, reducing that to zero in the context that we have is a really challenging proposition because it would mean that no new parking could be built, which meant that everybody would be commuting or moving. All mobility would be limited to things that are non-automobile and in all of those new buildings. And I guess I would say that we would need a much more robust transit system. We would need a much more robust mobility by other sustainable mechanisms, which we are all working towards, but the transit is kind of the linchpin of that in order to be able to get people back and forth in a fast and efficient manner. And even in terms of where we have that kind of like right by T stations, you might be able to consider it, but very quickly it diminishes to not being a viable alternative for every single person. Like there are some people who would live 15-20 minute walk from the T and might still be able to still make that choice to go that way. But for, if you're older or you have children, it may not be a feasible option to do, even if we're talking about non-residential, for people coming there to be able to do all of the steps that they need to do in running their regular life to be able to get to work. So I would say that maximum question, while technically something that can be, technically from a zoning perspective, it's an easy change to make, but the underpinnings of what would make that a viable alternative, others may have different ideas. I don't think that in the city we are quite at that place yet.
I'm going to go to other councillors. We can do another round of questions if we need to. Vice Mayor Mellon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, through you, and thanks to the city staff for putting together this comprehensive presentation. Just following up on my colleague's comments, referring back to the presentation, it looks like the maximum for Kendall Square and Central Square was changed. For office, it's 0.9 and lab is 0.8. And it seems like the city did that probably very intentionally around the transit nodes and the fact that, those were both places that could be readily accessed by multiple transit modes. But, if you look at the maximum in KSA and Central Square for office and lab, it's a lot less, like half of the max in the rest of the city. So we could consider, changing the maximum given the constraints that Mr. Roberts and Ms. Farouk have just outlined pretty in a detailed fashion. We could look at those maximums and look to see if we can apply them citywide. And I'm assuming that's the study, part of the study that the staff is prepared to do in the fall of 21 as part of this presentation. Is that correct, that we are going to be looking at just such items like this and parking minimums and maximums as part of that study? That's a question for any of the staff.
Yes, that is exactly the type of thing we will be looking at.
Okay, thank you, Stephanie. And then through you, Mr. Chair, when Ms. Grohl was doing her part of the presentation, she presented parking trends and single occupancy vehicle trip trends from 2016 to, it ended in 2016. Will we also be doing studies from 2016 to 2021 as part of that study? It seems like these last 5 years should be important.
Through you, Mr. Chair. We will be looking at all the data that we have. The American Community Survey data will encompass this time period. The PTDM and special permit monitoring data, we did take a 2-year pause on monitoring because it was something that we thought we needed to do to support local businesses, and it was not a generally common travel pattern that was happening. And now we will begin monitoring again in spring of 2022, and we'll start incorporating again as soon as we have more updated information.
Okay, thank you. I think having that information will be very helpful. I think it's sometimes hard to look at traffic patterns in the context of what we're looking at when it ended 5 years ago, because I would imagine that it has changed pretty substantially since then. In terms of the study, I just had a question. Are we using some sort of outside firm to conduct the study and do the community outreach, or are we keeping this in-house?
Through you, Mr. Chair. We had planned on doing it internally. This is not a budgeted item, but it is something that we have added to the staff work plans.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. And then I had a question for Mr. Barr. When you were talking about the commercial parking freeze ordinance and some ideas on perhaps changing our thinking about that and having a stricter limit on accessory parking to allow for more flexible commercial parking. I'm just curious if you have some examples of what that might look like for us to consider as we're thinking about this. I know one of the things we've talked about in the past was having a program similar to what Somerville has for our small businesses, having some type of parking permit for employees. I'm wondering if that is one of the examples that Mr. Barr was thinking about when they thought about more flexible commercial parking that could be considered.
Through you, Councilor Sabrina-Wheeler, I guess to sort of answer generally and then specifically about the question you raised. I mean, I think that the example that always comes to my mind, and I'm not saying that there's not other impacts of this, so I'm not saying that this is something we would want to do, but it's sort of the kind of thing that's not feasible right now with the commercial parking freeze is as we remove, parking for things like bike lanes and bus lanes and other, sort of sustainable transportation, and that removes, as was pointed out by some of the commenters, opportunities for people to park on street. Cambridge, other than in certain locations like the squares, but even there, not always, doesn't have that many off-street kind of, I can just go park, in a lot or in a garage options like you might find in downtown Boston. And so I think one of the challenges when we remove parking, whether it's residential or non-residential, from the streets is that there aren't often options off-street because creating those options would generally require commercial parking. And there's just not a lot of it in the city. And obviously off-street parking facilities have their own land use consequences, and we sort of need to think about that very carefully. But right now that's not even something that's able to be created easily. So I think, it's really creating a more flexible system for off-street parking. I know the specific example you mentioned is really about on-street. So there's other issues around that in terms of how the resident permit parking program works. But that's not specifically about commercial parking because on-street parking on the public way is not part of the commercial parking inventory, although like I said, our off-street parking lots and garages are part of that. So just to go back to my first example, if we wanted to create a new off-street parking lot somewhere to help serve businesses in a location where, on-street parking was being limited due to some, other change in the street, that's would require new commercial parking permits to be issued, which is not something that, for a couple of different reasons, we can do right now. So the additional flexibility that I was mentioning is to sort of partially, not only to enable those kinds of things to occur, again, assuming that was some outcome that we were looking for, which is obviously not a predetermined thing.
Okay, thank you. I think that's helpful. I was confused, I think, about what that looks like in terms of the parking freeze and then what more flexible commercial parking looks like. My last question is sort of a very specific question around something that was in the presentation, that there's no tandem parking allowed in our zoning. Did I read that correctly for residential?
Yeah, through the chair, I'll take this. So the way our zoning is written out, parking spaces have to be independently accessible. So if you were to have tandem parking, meaning that somebody could potentially not be able to get their car out if somebody else was parked behind them, that requires a special permit.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Roberts. Through you, this just did come up at a recent BZA meeting. It was hotly contested and talked about, and it seemed to me a very onerous part of our zoning that we would not allow tandem parking residentially. So I know it's just a small thing, but it does seem like homeowners, who are looking to reconfigure their lots have to go for a special permit, or before the BZA, just to allow it just seems silly. So I hope in the larger context that we do kind of look at even these small things that cost residents quite a bit of time and angst over. I mean, I think we all saw, the permit was maybe not going to be approved, which I just think is a silly use of our BZA time and for our residents. So I'll yield back at this point, Mr. Chair. Thank you for allowing me to speak, and thanks to the staff for putting together this presentation.
Ms. Rasmussen, did you want to respond there as well?
Yes, thank you. Through you, Mr. Chair, I wanted to just add a few thoughts to the question about trend lines. Of course, this is something that is a huge challenge for us now, because I think all bets are off in terms of what the exact trend lines will be. And there's been a lot of coverage of that in the media in the last few days. The McKinsey report that's talking about the potential of the 20% drop in office, inner city in office occupation, potentially a 15 to 50% drop in people who are using commuter rail. And then simultaneously, we also see things that's saying that in Kendall Square, Facebook and Google and Apple and those companies are staffing up hugely. So we're trying very actively to understand how this is unfolding, but I think we don't know how the next several years are going to look in terms of what will trip generation per square foot be in particularly in commercial development. So that is to be seen. Thank you.
Carolyn?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. By the way, there have been many studies on cities and change in economics, and always the healthy cities have bounced back, and I expect Cambridge within a few years will, especially given some of the unique uses we have in the city. Daniel Shope's comment was highlighted earlier. He's a well-known, nationally known traffic engineer and analyzer of situations. One of the things he said, looking at national statistics, is, and Joe Barr, please correct me if I have or others, if I have the numbers wrong, for every car in the country, there are 7 parking spaces. Now, that's not Cambridge, but that makes me want to ask, how many city permit parking spaces do we have on the streets? I know we have 30, I think Stephanie showed us about 38,000 permits, but how many spaces do we have? I'm assuming it's higher than that and maybe near 50. Does anyone know?
To Councilor Sabrina Wheeler, we surprisingly, perhaps, we actually don't know the answer to that question. We've never done a full inventory of the sort of curb frontage that's designated for resident parking. In any case, it would be an estimate because unlike meter parking spaces, they're not, boxed out in a specific number. So it's really just an assumption about, how many cars can fit per linear foot. Which we could do that calculation if we knew that linear footage, which we don't, although we are in the process of doing a curb inventory of our parking regulations, which eventually will allow us to make an estimate of that linear footage. I would say that my guess is that overall there's more curb frontage than there is parking permits, if you divide by 20 feet for a car, but it's obviously not evenly distributed around the city. So, there are parts obviously of, Western Cambridge where there's much more supply than demand, and then parts of Eastern Cambridge where there's much more or significantly more demand than supply. But again, we should have an answer to that, hopefully in the not too distant future, but it's not an answer I can provide currently.
Thank you. I agree that you're going to need that. I mean, there are neighborhoods that complain left and right about new development impacting their street parking. Commercial parking limits. I know, and I'm happy that any parking above grade counts as FAR. Is that, I don't think we're going to see much, but is that the limit on commercial parking? It's FAR?
Through the chair, this is Jeff Roberts. I'll just try to answer that quickly. So that is one, I didn't mention that, but that is one of the important limitations we have in zoning. If you, in our current zoning, if you build above grade structured parking, it's subject to all the same regulations as a building, including your FAR, your height, your setbacks, and that really does, it changes sort of the economic equation. So as some of the commenters pointed out, if you have to make a choice between building space that could be used for housing or office or whatever else, and that count, and then the parking that goes along with that counts as part of the building, then that's something that can discourage the overbuilding of parking, and it does encourage parking to be put below grade. But in addition to that, there are the maximum parking limits that I described before.
Even for commercial parking?
Yes. For accessory parking for commercial uses.
Yeah.
So as I said, we actually don't see a whole lot of principal use parking. We don't see a whole lot of people, proposing commercial parking lots or your parking structures, and that part of that's what Joe described, the regulations that make that difficult, but also there's the economic factor that people would rather build things other than parking.
And lastly, I'll say that there are those of us who remember Kendall Square and North Point as large parking lots, and having worked on North Point, the early studies, I know MGH was using lots there. So there was a different time. Now, thank God in fact, when we did East Cambridge Riverfront, believe it or not, the state wanted us not to develop much of it because it would create more traffic, if you can believe that. So it's a different mentality now. I appreciate this presentation. I thought it was quite in depth, and I think it's great that this next study is happening. I think it's well needed. And the Vice Mayor raised concerns about other districts that the zoning requirement parking should be lowered, and I agree. So I think this is well needed, and I congratulate the chair for bringing this to the council committee. Thank you.
Great. I had a few questions, and then it seems like we'll have time for another round from councilors, if that's wanted. I have one question about if there has been a study done in Cambridge at some point on the impact of reducing parking minimums on street parking, or if that's just sort of more of an anecdotal thought. It makes sense to me that reducing the amount of required parking could lead to more cars on the street, but I'm curious if that's one-to-one. We know that for commercial development, for instance, if workers are driving in from outside the city, they're not eligible for a residential permit, so that shouldn't lead to more cars on the street. But for residential parking, what is the ratio there? For instance, the folks I know who are looking for a apartment or a house with a parking spot, they're looking for that, and if they can't find that in Cambridge, they may go somewhere else, which is maybe okay if they want to have a sort of car dependent lifestyle. Is that a study or data that we have, or is that going to be part of the upcoming study?
So who wants to start?
Go ahead, Jeff.
Oh, well, I was just going to start, and maybe Joe can add to this, because I know traffic and parking has been really involved. So while one thing that we have done that we know a little bit about is, as development proposals have come forward with proposed reductions in parking, they're required by zoning, if they're seeking that reduction, to provide some analysis showing what the effects might be. And in many cases, they'll look at nearby residential developments, and they'll look at what the demand is for parking within their parking garage, to try to understand what those ratios might be. That kind of analysis gets very complicated very fast, because you have to think about how many people are parking in the garage, how many of a building, how many people are parking on the street. If people have resident permit parking stickers, they might still be parking in the garage, because having a resident permit parking sticker means they might want that for parking elsewhere if they need to go across the city. What we found from that is that when you have reduced parking for residential uses, it does affect the number of cars that are owned by residents of the building. People who don't own cars might be more amenable to renting space there. And there's kind of a split. Some people with cars will park in the garage. Some will choose to park out on the street. Some of that has to do with the pricing of the parking. That's also a kind of a confounding factor. So there's so many confounding factors that it's hard to tell. I think the one conclusion I've been able to draw from it is people make lots of different individual choices, and the availability of parking, the price of parking, and just the making the choice about whether to hunt for on-street parking in order to save money on off-street parking costs. Those are all very individual choices, and it kind of breaks out in a variety of different ways. It's not easy to get a full handle on. So Joe, do you want to? That's very vague, but yeah.
Before we go to Joe, I wanted to say one thing about part of your question had to do with whether this is going to be part of what we propose as the study to come forward. And that is not part of the study, just because it's very difficult to do in-house, because to try to determine the impacts of it's sort of all hypothetical, because there isn't really a way to measure and monitor in real time, because it would all have to be some sort of econometric analysis of modeling what the impacts of certain prices or certain changes in numbers of parking on site would have on off-site, on street parking, and then the capacity would come into play as well, and it's likely different in different parts of the city based on where as I think Joe had said earlier, which parts of the city have more on-street parking available compared to the amount of development versus other parts where there isn't. So it would be a very, very complicated analysis, and it's certainly not something that we would be able to do with our in-house staff capacity. So it would. I would say that that's the reason why it's not part of the proposed analysis. And then I'm going to turn it over to Joe to say whatever he was going to add to that.
I think Jeff and Aram pretty much covered everything I was going to say. The only thing I would add is just I think that the best way to try to look at this would be to see if we could identify, a reasonably sized new residential development that didn't have parking and actually do sort of case study on, what happens on the adjacent streets before and after. So I'm not thinking of anything off the top of my head that would be a great candidate, but I think it is something we should look out for because as Jeff said, and Aram said, it's a very complicated interaction. So logically, it makes sense that there's a connection between the two, but in terms of, the substitutability of the two, it's a little unclear, particularly because like Jeff said, people get resident permits even if they have off-street parking because it's, for $25, it's a good deal for parking all over the city.
Ms. Wilson, did you want to weigh in there as well?
Yes, thank you. Through you, Mr. Chair. Just to say that we're very challenged in terms of understanding auto ownership in the city because of the inability to get proper data out of the Registry of Motor Vehicles. It's something that is very important to us, especially in the context of understanding greenhouse gas emissions and how they change over time, but it is just not available, and it's something we're pressuring the state on being made available to the cities in the future. But right now we can't access that information in a meaningful way because the way they collect the data is just every time you buy a car, then you show up in their database, and they don't have a good mechanism for subtracting at the other end. So it would be really, really useful, and it's different from what happens with whether people get a resident parking sticker or not, but it's just not yet something that we can rely on. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And then another question was on the resident parking permit fee, and I'm glad to hear that looking at a low-income exemption is something that's being thought about. I don't know the perfect costs of a residential parking fee, but when an MBTA link pass, I was just looking at the cost of it. Monthly is $90, comes out to $1,080 a year. And we have a $25 cost for a permit fee, something that doesn't quite line up. And I understand the sort of idea that there are other parking costs there, but looking at that number and trying to make that more in line with the cost of parking in the city and sort of the externalities that go along with that, I think would make a lot of sense. And especially if we can exempt folks for whom 25 or 50 or dollars would be a real burden, then we can actually think about what the real externalities are and price that accordingly. My question was, even beyond looking at exemptions, is thinking about a structure to make it progressive and the way that other fees are. And one thought I had was car registration fees, which residents are required to pay every year, are already progressive in sort of that way, I believe. It's tied to the year of the purchase of the car and depreciates. Is that something that the city has ever looked at, tying it to the registration fee or another mechanism that sort of we already have for progressive fees and doing it that way?
To you, Mr. Chair. I guess, no, it's not something that we've contemplated before. As you pointed out, the motor vehicle excise tax is something where there's a formula based on the, original value of the vehicle and the, depreciation, et cetera. And, although that I not really thought about it, so I may say something that sounds a little uninformed in the next 30 seconds. I mean, so while there's certainly questions in my mind about does that truly relate to, the sort of income of the resident, there's probably some relationship, although I'm sure, in our frugal New England ways, there's probably you hear about the, millionaires driving around in a 15-year-old Volvo who would, probably not pay that much. But, certainly if someone is lower income, I assume, again, have not researched this issue. I assume that there's probably a lower likelihood that they're going to own a really expensive vehicle. But yeah, it's an interesting thought, although it just becomes sort of like, well, then let's just charge people more for motor vehicle excise tax and include a resident sticker potentially is sort of one way to look at it. But, so it's certainly worth considering in the whole discussion, but yeah, it's not been suggested before, which is why I'm struggling a little bit to say anything intelligent in this moment.
No worries. I just wanted to raise it because it seems like that is one progressive way we're already doing of motor vehicle excise tax, and it could be, not a big additional burden to tie it to that. The last quick question I had was, in thinking about residential parking permits, when you get a permit, it's to park anywhere on the street in the city. That's not how we do visitor permits. It's by zone. So I'm just curious if that's ever something we've thought about. Having a residential permit fee by zone, and then the rest of the parking in the city is 2-hour parking or something. And related to that, we have a lot of residents who have garage parking or a parking space in front of their house who still qualify for a residential permit. And then, if they have visitors over, they can park in the driveway and they can put their car on the street. Have we ever looked at, changes to the residential parking fee like that, so that if you have a garage space or a parking space in front of your house, which I think we should have records of, you don't qualify for a parking permit, and also that sort of doing it by zone piece?
So in terms of the zone piece, that's certainly how Boston does their resident permits, and there are many other cities that have zone resident parking. We've not considered that. I think the city's it's 6.2 square mile city, so there's less geography to cover it, and I wouldn't necessarily think that maybe doing it on the same fairly granular geography that we do the visitor permits on would make sense. But if we're having, I guess what I would say is, if we're having a conversation about changes to resident parking, policies, as opposed to purely just about the cost, and thinking about what allows people to travel around the city for reasons we might or might not support. For example, I think going to support local businesses and being able to travel for that purpose and parking resident parking, we might feel more positively about than commuting to work every day. And just because you happen to because you live in Cambridge, then you can park in East Cambridge and commute to Kendall Square. Perhaps something we're less excited about. Although, as was pointed out, the sort of mode split for Cambridge residents is already pretty good. So yeah, I think it's worth discussing. It's like I said, it's not something we've analyzed in the past, so I think it's something where we'd have to look and think about the impacts and what the right policies are. There's obviously challenges around enforcement as well, but I think with the technology we use currently, I think with the right approach, that could probably be solved for without making life too much more challenging for the staff who are actually doing the enforcement. In terms of the other piece, I think I'm not a lawyer, just to be clear, but my understanding is that anytime we start talking about not allowing certain residents to have permits, based on whatever factor, because we also get requests for new residential development, just this new building shouldn't be allowed to have resident permits, just sort of, regardless of how much off-street parking they might or might not be providing. There's a constitutional issue around equal protection, and that creates a danger that someone could challenge the entire program because we're sort of discriminating against people based on where they live, and so which is to some extent a threat to the entire program, but that's been challenged before and that challenge was not successful. Why do I get to park here just because I live in Cambridge, and just because I don't live in Cambridge, I can't park here. But I think if we started to sort of segment it beyond that, I think we'd be asking for at least the very least, some challenges to the legality of that. So I don't want to say categorically no, because again, I'm not the city solicitor, but I know that there's definitely concerns about anything that along those lines.
Thank you. We're going to go to Councillor Zondervan, followed by Vice Mayor Mallon. Councillor Zondervan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's a very interesting discussion. I did want to go back briefly to the earlier discussion about zero parking maximums and point us to the net zero emissions efforts that Councilor Carolyn and I were part of almost a decade ago now. And of course, at that time and even now, we didn't quite know how we would get to zero emissions, and certainly everyone in the conversation, including many people present here, understood that we couldn't immediately get to zero, but we all agreed that we could create a pathway to get there. And I think this could be viewed as a very similar situation, that sure, we may not feel that we're ready to eliminate individual car use in the city tomorrow, and so going to from where we are to zero parking maximums might be hard to imagine, but we can put together a plan that gets us there by 2050 or 2040 or whatever we think is reasonable, and then put ourselves on a diet, so to speak, where we go lower and lower on the maximums until we get to zero. And I totally agree and understand and appreciate that it's very hard for us to predict the trends and understand where all of this is going. But I do think we all agree that we want to get to a place where there's far less individual car ownership and usage, and that all the technology and economic trends seem to be heading in that direction. So why not put together a plan that gets us to zero in a reasonable time frame? And again, I want to put forward that the flip side of that, and I totally agree with Ms. Farouk's comments about, once you get just a little bit removed from public transit stations, it's very difficult for people to get around with a car. I know that personally, which is why it's really important that we also design the alternatives. When we were discussing net zero, and even now when we discuss that, we don't just focus on, how do we take away the fossil fuels? We also focus on how do we get solar panels and wind turbines everywhere. So similarly, in this conversation, we really need to think about what are the alternatives, and we need to go beyond blue bikes, which are great, but for example, I can't get on a blue bike right now. So thinking about free transit services, we have some shuttle services in place in the city right now, and again, going from there to ubiquitous free transit overnight is hard to imagine, but we could plan for it and implement and expand it over time so that it does become much more convenient for people to use alternative transit compared to the owning and operating an individual vehicle. I also did want to comment briefly on the parking permit fees. I mean, that conversation too, I've been part of it literally for over a decade. I mean, I go back to 2009 when I was advocating at City Hall to increase the parking permit fee. So it is a little bit frustrating that we're still dancing around that and not coming forward with clear plans to say, here's how we get to a reasonable fee, over a 10-year period, right? It doesn't have to be overnight, but plan it out, put in place the appropriate means testing so that we're not burdening low-income residents. Obviously, we don't want to do that, but make it progressive so that people who can afford it, like myself, can pay more if we want a parking permit, and use some of that money to subsidize free transit so that people who can afford it have better options. I recently was at the Sherman Street parking lot at Danny Park, and there's like over half a dozen shuttle buses parked there, some of them with flat tires, rusting out. And, they all say senior center on them, but they're clearly massively underutilized. So, there are solutions available to us. And again, with the technology improvements, we should be able to very soon, if not already, operate electric vehicle shuttle buses that are effectively zero transmission in operation and provide convenient transit services to people who need that and make it more and more possible for people to get around without owning or operating a vehicle. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Mellon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just to follow up on Councillor Zondervan's comment about shuttles, I know the East Cambridge Business Association has been advocating for a free hop-on, hop-off shuttle to run the length of Cambridge Street from Lechmere to Inman Square to encourage folks who live and work in that part of East Cambridge to utilize the businesses and the restaurants all the way up to Inman Square. So I think that there are definitely opportunities for us to be thinking about how we can be more creative around using shuttles, both to bolster, our small businesses as they're struggling in our restaurants, but also to, remove cars off the road and provide a more sustainable way to get from one place to another in the city. In terms of parking permits, I am glad that this group is going to be convening a study to really think about how to put forward a new program that works for everyone with getting that community feedback. Because we have been having this conversation for a long time and we end up always ending at, well, we need a means testing, and what does means testing look like? I think Mr. Barr, thinking about using already existing programs like fuel assistance, like SNAP, just to make sure that people can check a box and receive a lower price parking permit and are not overly burdened by a big increase. But I am part of the presentation, and something I've been saying for a while is we do need a graduated parking permit program. There's no reason that anyone in the city should have 6 cars, right? If you have 6 cars in the city, you have 4 cars in the city registered to one household, you should have a graduated rate. You shouldn't be paying $100 a year to have 4 cars on our city streets every year. So, what that looks like, if it's $50 for the first car, $100 for the next, and then, $250 for the next. I hope that this is something that the study will really look at and try to figure out, do we need a graduated parking permit rate? And is that going to be the thing that discourages those additional cars on our city streets and owned by residents? Because I agree, moving the resident parking permit from $25 to $40 is not going to discourage car use. It just isn't. And it will generate additional revenue for our city and for the program. I think that's, a laudable goal. But if our goal is to make sure that we are moving people to more sustainable modes of transportation, I think a $15 increase across the board just isn't going to do it. So thinking about that graduated parking permit rate, I think is going to be essential for this conversation. And just to throw out there, I think, if we are really wanting to get people into alternative, more sustainable modes of transportation, we should think about how the city can use funds to encourage people to get into more sustainable modes of transportation. If you think about electric bikes, for somebody like Councillor Zondervan with mobility issues who can't ride a bike, an electric bike might be a more, usable solution for him and for others like him. But they're very expensive. There could be ways that the city could figure out how to provide a rebate or how to provide a low interest loan through our municipal banking program with the city, something that would actually, allow people to have access to those bikes and get cars off the road. I think people would make that mode shift if they were able to in a financially feasible way. So I'll yield back at this time, but I really wanted to throw out the idea of graduated parking permits to be looked at very seriously in this study. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Great, thank you. I had just a couple brief comments, and I think we can end on time at noon. The piece I wanted to focus on was the parking minimums, and the fact that eliminating parking minimums doesn't mean no new parking in the city. It just means the city isn't requiring residential buildings and businesses to have new parking. It allows them to determine for themselves what's the right amount of parking to have. That both has environmental benefits, it has benefits for getting around the city, but it also just reduces burdens for small businesses, for residential building, to not have to worry about meeting the city's requirements for parking. And at some point, I think parking minimums are kind of patronizing to say to a small business, we don't trust you to have the right amount of parking, we're gonna require it, and you've gotta meet that burden. I just don't think we need it in 2021. Thinking of the recent MAPC study that showed the average cost to build a parking space is $15,000 per space, and that 30% of spaces in new residential buildings go unused. And I'm sure those figures might be a little different for Cambridge in particular, but all of those dollars and all of that space is money and space that could go to affordable housing, community space, green space. I think parking maximums do require a little more study to figure it out based on the area, based on proximity to transit. But the example I think of is South Station and the development above there that's going to have hundreds of new parking spaces above the biggest transit center in New England. And I'm not a traffic engineer, but it doesn't seem like the best space to require new parking or to allow new parking right above a big transit hub like that. Less parking may mean additional street parking. I think it's worth thinking about that, but I also just want to reiterate that new parking incentivizes more cars in the city, and so new cars in the city mean more traffic for everyone in the city. That's including whether you have a car right now and are going to have to deal with that more traffic, or if you don't have a car and you take the bus, you take the shuttle, you walk, or you bike. All of the times that we require or incentivize new parking means more traffic that all our residents are going to have to put up with. And so it makes sense to think about our city policies and how they incentivize or disincentivize, more parking. So I look forward to working with other councilors on a policy order or zoning amendment on, eliminating commercial and residential parking minimums in the near future, and look forward to the study from staff in the city as well about some of these other parking issues, which I think will be really helpful and include that community input, which I think should be a good part of this. So on a motion to adjourn the meeting, Mr. Clerk?
On that motion, Vice Mayor Mallon.
Yes.
Yes. Councilor Nolan. Absent. Councilor Toomey. Absent. Councilor Zondervan. Councilor Zondervan.
Yes.
Yes. Councilor Sabrina Wheeler.
Yes.
Motion passes 3 in favor, 2 absent.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.